Last year I released a bookbinding tutorial explaining how to make an A4 watercolour sketchbook with Fabriano Artistico watercolour paper. Since then, I've been making watercolour sketchbooks professionally, selling them on my online shop. Having made many dozens of books at various sizes with several different types of paper, I've refined my process, learned loads more about bookbinding, and now I want to share that knowledge with you. Hi, I'm Will J. Bailey, and this is a channel of in-depth tutorials for artists and illustrators. In my original bookbinding tutorial, I discussed sketchbooks in general, the characteristics and strengths of watercolour paper, and went through step by step how to make an A4 book. If you haven't seen it, I recommend watching it first, as I'll be referring to it throughout this video. You can find it here and in the description below. In this video, I'll discuss materials and tools in greater depth, answer some of the questions and points raised in the comments of part 1, and go over the whole bookbinding process again, detailing the improvements I've made and discussing certain elements in more detail. I want to start by pointing out that this bookbinding technique is suitable for most types of paper. It isn't limited to just watercolour paper. Now, I make my books with 100% cotton watercolour paper because it's by far the best surface for my practice, and it's very difficult to find books like it on the mainstream market. I mainly use my own book for painting with gouache and Indian ink, but it's also perfect for watercolour, obviously, and charcoal and graphite too. However, it's not the best surface for every medium. For pen and ink, it's hard to beat the durable, heavily sized, perfectly smooth surface of a good quality 300 GSM Bristol Board, like Strathmore 400. Alternatively, if you work in charcoal and white pastel, Strathmore Toned Grey is amazing and maybe just what you need. And there are lots of speciality papers like this that may be difficult to source in a sketchbook format, that you can make an extremely durable, flat opening, hardback book with using this bookbinding technique. And personally, Fabriano Artistico Hot Press Extra White is still my go-to paper, for all the reasons I laid out in part 1. However, be aware that it has just undergone another major revision. From a bookbinding perspective, the obvious differences are that the watermark has been made smaller and moved to the corner, and the long edges, which used to be cut, are now deckled. And it's now deckled on all 4 edges. This is actually a real pain, because the long edges are now slightly crooked and inconsistent, which can result in the text block being slightly uneven. However, this can be fixed relatively easily by removing them with a scalpel first. The other paper I use is Saunders Waterford. It's a lovely paper, slightly softer and thicker than Fabriano, as well as being a bit more expensive. It's similar to Arches Aquarelle. I mainly use it because it's long grain, unlike Fabriano, which is short grain, and this means I can make several different sized books without wastage. Assuming that you avoid wastage by tearing down paper into evenly sized pieces, the type of books that you can make with watercolour paper is dictated by the size of the sheets, generally a standardised 22 by 30 inches or 56 by 76 centimetres, and the grain direction, since the grain direction of all books must be parallel to the spine to prevent warping. As such, short grain paper, like Fabriano Artistico, can make a small landscape book, 14 by 19 centimetres, by tearing each sheet into 8 pieces, a large portrait book, the one from my first video, 19 by 28 centimetres, by tearing sheets into 4 pieces, and an extra large landscape book, 28 by 38 centimetres, which I haven't actually made yet, by tearing sheets into 2 pieces. And Saunders Waterford, as well as Arches Aquarelle, which is also long grain, can make exactly the same size books, but in the opposite orientation. So, a small portrait book, divided like this, a large landscape book, divided like this, and an extra large portrait book, divided like this. And a 40-page extra large book uses 10 sheets, a large book uses 5, and a small book uses 2.5. However, I prefer to make 2 small books from 5 sheets so that each one has the same top and bottom edges. After I've torn them into 4 pieces, I label the other sides 1A, 2A, 3A and 4A. Then once torn down into 8 pieces, I remove the A's to make a separate book. One book will have torn edges on top and bottom, and the other will have 1 torn edge and 1 cut edge. Of course, you don't have to divide your paper up evenly like this. Within the restraints of grain direction and sheet size, you can divide it however you like. It's perfectly possible to make, say, a small portrait book using Fabriano Artistico, and I have done this for a customer. You just have to accept a lot of wastage, and the paper is, of course, very expensive. The best way to do this is to first tear each large sheet down to the overall size it needs to be, by removing a single strip off the top and the side, and then tearing it down evenly as before. If you do want to make a book using another type of paper, such as Bristol Board, the process is essentially the same. Just work out the grain direction, as I demonstrated in part 1, and design the book accordingly. Now for the end papers, in part 1 I said to use cartridge paper, which is a bit vague to be honest. For that first book, I think I just used a couple of random pieces from my paper drawer. But since then, I've been using Bockingford hot press by St Cuthbert's Mill, which I buy in large sheets and cut down. And Bockingford is good quality 300 GSM mould-made watercolour paper, but it's made with wood pulp rather than cotton, so it's a lot cheaper. Now it's strong, folds, glues and cuts down really well, and has a decent colouring and a nice subtle texture, so it's perfect for the application. Now I buy all my paper, and in fact most of my art supplies, from Jackson's Art. For me, they're the best online art supply store in the UK. Links in the description below. If you use one and you're a first-time customer and create an account, you can get a 10% discount on your first order. For bookbinding supplies, I now use a company called J. Hewitt & Sons. They have a really broad range of stock and their prices are very competitive, particularly in larger quantities. Shipping is quite expensive, but it is really quick. I usually get mine next day. I recommend them. Again, links below. Now, I used to use Shepherd's, based in Victoria here in London, but because they're a prime retail store, they are a bit more expensive. But if you're based in London and you want to go to a physical shop, then they are still a good option. When it comes to boards for the covers, note there are 2 different types, greyboard and millboard. Millboard is denser and harder and much more expensive. And personally, I use greyboard, which I buy in large sheets and cut down. The standard size is 76 by 102 centimeters long grain. They come in several different thicknesses, and I use 2.5 millimeters. Of course, I make a lot of books, so it makes sense for me to buy in bulk. And if you just want to make one single book, then you might be better off using a company like Shepherd's or even Amazon or eBay. Again, just pay attention to the thickness and the grain direction, which, like with paper, must run parallel to the spine. For the glue, I don't use EVA anymore. It's fantastic stuff, but it's also really expensive, so instead I use PVA M289 from Hewitt. This is also archival, it's pH neutral and delaminates with water in case you need to deconstruct the book in the future, but it's much cheaper, just as strong and very similar to work with. One person in the comments asked if you can use different types of material as book cloth for the cover, and the answer is, of course, you can use whatever material you like. Using an interesting fabric or leather is definitely one way that you can personalise your book. But honestly, you can't beat Aberlave Library Buckram. It's tough, wipeable and really hard wearing. I still make my headbands with scrap buckram glued around a piece of string. When you make the headband, don't use too much glue or it will end up too stiff once dry. I use a Staedtler permanent Lumacolor pen to stain the string ends black. You can get creative with headbands, if you like, with ones like this from Shepherd's. Now, I don't think you need a special glue brush, though you can buy them. I just use a hog hair flat. And one person in the comments said that they tried to use a brush instead of a roller to glue their book cloth, and I definitely wouldn't recommend this. PVA dries too quickly, and it will probably end up inconsistently applied. For the roller, I use a Hamilton Perfection short pile woven. It works really well. It lays down just the right amount of glue, doesn't shed, and because it uses ball bearings, it doesn't skid or stick. I used to use a foam gloss roller, but they're not really ideal. They keep absorbing more and more glue, but they don't actually really lay down enough. And one really important thing that I did wrong in my first video was not wearing gloves. It pains me to watch that now. I have the driest hands, but I always wear gloves when handling the paper to protect it from grease and oils. I also wear them when applying glue, as PVA isn't actually as chemically benign as you might think. My favourite brand is Blue Nitrile Bodyguards by Polyco. Now I have, up until very recently, continued to use heavy art books to press my sketchbooks. There's nothing wrong with this method at all. I have, however, just bought this steel bookbinding press from Viva. It's good, it's pretty well made and very heavy, and at £85 it wasn't too expensive. It is useful to be able to gradually increase the load to shape the text block. Okay, so now let's go back through the process of actually making a book. I'm going to explain the changes and improvements that I've made to my process and add some detail here and there, but I'm not going to go over everything again as I'll just end up repeating the first video. So again, if you haven't seen that, make sure to watch it first. First, I cut off the deckled long edges of the revised Fabriano Artistico paper using a scalpel. Obviously, this stage isn't necessary with other papers, which for the most part are only deckled on two sides. Using an HB pencil, I mark the bottom of the indentation on the top edge, one on each side, and join them up with a long ruler. I then flip the paper over, measure and mark a distance of 56.1 centimetres, again one on each side, joining them up. Then I make the cuts. With this done, it's much easier to make the text block even and neat. One edge will be torn and the other cut. And you may find that the outside edge of the book is slightly more uneven as a result, but since it remains deckled, this really isn't an issue. When you number the corners to divide the paper, make the marks really lightly in pencil. In the first video, I practically carved them on. When folding, I use tracing paper to protect it from burnishing, specifically Daler Rowney A390 GSM. It's really strong and it's useful to be able to see through it. To make sure the paper divides evenly, first make sure the corners meet, then fold it loosely and approximately. Check again that the corners and edges line up. If the outside deckled edges don't also align all the way down, just make sure that they meet in the middle. Then apply pressure and then fold it flat with the bone folder. And you can tell that Fabriano has changed because in the first video my bone folder cut through the paper like a hot knife through butter, and it doesn't do that now. It's much more difficult and you have to progress with difficulty a centimetre or so at a time. Be very careful not to let the bone folder slip off to the side and tear into the sheet. It's so annoying when this happens, as it ruins a page. Some sheets seem to be more prone to doing this than others, I guess due to imperfections. Folding it really sharp helps, as does applying pressure with your left hand as you move steadily up. But mainly you just need to concentrate and relax your hand if you feel any sideways movement. Be particularly careful when you get to the end, as it's really easy to tear off a corner. Once all the pieces have been torn, folded and combined into a text block, I sandwich it in between two pieces of scrap greyboard. Tap it into shape on the tabletop, and then press it for half an hour or so to flatten the folds. This makes the sewing stage much easier. When marking out the punch holes, I shape the text block on the tabletop using a small piece of wood. I make sure the cut ends of the leaves are aligned, then weigh it down with a couple of books placed on top of a scrap piece of greyboard. I use the square edge of my ruler to draw the vertical lines, but you could alternatively use a set square. When punching the holes, make sure the leaves stay pressed together in your hands and correctly aligned. It's really easy for them to slip out of place. Push the awl into the pencil mark, just enough to show through on the other side, but without actually going through. Then flip the leaf over and punch it through from the back. And make sure the leaves remain in the same order as when you marked them. For the sewing stage, I now use a pair of tweezers to pull the thread tight. I press the leaves together with my left hand, whilst pulling the thread tight with the tweezers in my right, and I move steadily across from one side to the other. I thought I should clarify the bowline knot for joining threads, as I rushed this a bit in part 1. Each thread should be looped underneath itself with the ends pointing upwards. One in each hand pressed tightly between thumb and forefinger. Push the right loop inside the left loop and over the top of the left thread. Let go of your left hand only, take hold of the thread end alongside the thread itself and pull both sides tight. In the first video, I glued on the end papers after pressing and gluing the spine, but I now do this before. It's much better for the edges of the end papers to be glued in place along with the rest of the text block. First, I cut out the end papers from a large sheet of Bockingford. Like Fabriano, this is a short grain paper, so a sheet can be divided into 4 pieces to make 2 sets for 2 large portrait books. Just. They are a bit narrower than the text block on the outside edge, but this is totally fine. The top and bottom will match perfectly in size as long as you've trimmed off the top and bottom deckled edges of the Fabriano paper, which is another reason to do that. Bockingford has a distinct front and back. You can tell which is which by holding it up horizontally underneath a vertical light. The back of the paper has a much flatter texture. Place it face down and work on the rear of the paper. Measure and mark the halfway points of all 4 edges, then join them up. Make sure to measure both long and short edges from the same side, or the pieces may end up misshapen and won't line up when folded. A quick tip for cutting out paper and board with a scalpel. Use the sharp point of your blade, I use a Swan Morton 10A, to make an indentation into the pencil mark where you measured, and press your cutting ruler up against the blade. Hold it firmly in place and repeat on the other side. And when you make the first cut, you should be able to feel the blade going through both indentations so that you know the cut is accurate. The pencil line is just there for reference. Apply very little pressure on the blade and make the cut in several passes. The first one should just score the paper. This helps avoid costly mistakes with the blade veering off course, which is really easy to do if you try to make cuts too quickly using too much weight. When gluing the end papers, I now use a 2 cm strip rather than 1.5 cm as per the first video. Also, I place pieces of greaseproof paper between the top pages of the text block and the end papers to stop glue from creeping around the edges and sticking them together. Using a nice thick line of glue, I do one side at a time, pressing them down with my hands until they set, whilst making sure they don't move out of alignment. When pressing the text block to glue the spine, first I make sure the leaves are correctly aligned and that the spine is nice and square by tapping it on the tabletop and shaping it using my wooden piece. Then I sandwich it in between 2 pieces of scrap greyboard, inset from the spine edge by a couple of millimeters. If you're using books as a press, place a drawing board or 2 underneath them to prevent the books from curving and to make sure the weight is distributed evenly across the whole book and over the spine. Also, just double check that the text block and the greyboards don't shift when you pile on the weight. Note that unlike in the first video, I leave the linen tape sticking out. Once the text block is under pressure, you can pull this tight before gluing. And you can actually treat making the text block completely separately from making the cover. They don't need to be done at the same time. You can press the text block overnight and then make and attach the cover the next day or whenever. I quite often do this, in which case once the cover is attached and the book is complete, it doesn't need to be pressed for quite as long. A few hours will do. When it comes to working out the measurements for the cover, Note that I now leave 7mm between the edge of the spine and the boards, not 1cm as per the first video. When you cut the boards down to size, it can be tricky to get the edges perfectly square and not to cut them at an angle, since that's naturally how your hand sits. If you really try to adjust your technique, you can sometimes get them perfect, but usually I sand them flat. Take both boards, align them, clamp them together, then, using 60 grit sandpaper, I use Liberty Green, sand them as a pair. Where this causes the edges to protrude out, remove this by sanding outwards. Make sure to wear a proper dust mask when you're doing this, as the dust is really fine and probably not very good for you. Since the boards may not be perfectly square, it's important that they remain paired in the same configuration as they were sanded. Open them up with the matching edges on the outside. If one set of corners and edges are better than the other, put these on the outside as the inside ones will be hidden. Label the outside corners A and B so that you know which ones are which and where they go. I draw around the boards using a white Sakura jelly roll or Pitt artist brush pen. Making a template to correctly space out the boards is a good idea, but you don't need to use it in the gluing stage. Once you've drawn around the boards, just put it to one side. Also, I cut out the cloth with scissors now, rather than a scalpel. Make sure to mark where the spine will go. I draw a pair of lines 9mm in as a guide. In the first video, I glued the cloth and pressed it onto the board, but that's completely the wrong way round. Glue the board using a roller and press that onto the cloth. If you recently cleaned your roller and it's still wet, make sure to absorb all the water out of the pile first using kitchen roll and flick out any water trapped inside the casing, because if any spills onto the board as you're gluing, it can cause a bubble under the cloth. After laying down the glued board, flip it over and use a small piece of greaseproof paper to rub and press down the cloth, including over and around all of the edges, to help adhere them together. When you lay down the second board, and again refer to the letters that you mark to make sure that they're configured correctly, lay a ruler across the top of the previously glued board and use this as a guide to ensure that both top edges perfectly line up. Glue the spine onto the cover in exactly the same way as the boards. Don't brush glue onto the cloth as per the first video. Roll of the paper, I use 300 GSM cold press watercolour paper. Lay it down between the guidelines, flip the cover over and rub it down with greaseproof paper. To get perfect corners on your cover, take the point of your scalpel and inset it around 1mm or so diagonally out from the corner of the board. Cut downwards at an angle only just shy of vertical, then repeat on the other side to remove the corner. This millimetre inset is crucial because it allows the cloth to wrap around the board. And it's important not to make the angle of the flaps too shallow, or there won't be enough material to cover the corners, and the board will show through. Also, make sure the joint between both cuts is perfectly sharp. If there's any fraying, this will stick out once the fabric is wrapped around. Using a pointed scalpel, like the Swan Morton No. 10A, will help with that. Before the glue dries, you can shape the corners a little bit, and if you do leave some board showing, it's not the end of the world. Just use a permanent black marker to hide it. Going back to the text block, in the first video I said to glue on top of the mull as well as underneath it, but you don't need to do that. A single thick layer of glue brushed underneath will do. When you attach the text block to the cover, place a piece of greaseproof paper in between the end papers when rollering to help stop the PVA from creeping in between the pages and gluing them together. Remove the greaseproof paper and loosely place the end paper onto the cover where you marked. But before properly pressing it down, immediately open out the other end paper to make sure it lines up with the marks on the other side. And if it doesn't, adjust it accordingly. This needs to be done really quickly as the glue sets fast. As with the book cloth, take a piece of greaseproof paper and rub down the end paper to press it onto the cover. Rub it all over, but pay particular attention to the edges. Once it's firmly attached, take a piece of very lightly dampened cloth or kitchen roll and wipe away any glue that may have spread around the edges. Close the book and move on to the other side. Once you've rolled the glue onto the other side and removed the greaseproof paper, hold the book in an L shape before briefly closing the book shut, and then follow the same procedure as before. Place a piece of clean greaseproof paper between the end papers and sandwich it in between two pieces of scrap board and tracing paper to protect it from scratches and indentations. And that's it, my refined bookbinding process after a year of making nearly 100 books. If you've made one yourself, or if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you like the video, please give it a like, and if you want to see more content like this, please give me a follow. And until next time, ciao.